Hours before the dinner began, David Cole was mopping the executive corridor. Same floor, same silence, same forgotten man. He saw the bottle then, delivered early, sitting on a silver tray outside the penthouse kitchen, the label too new for a vintage that old. He wiped around it, but the scent followed him, faintly sweet, wrong in a way his old training couldn't ignore. He'd handled chemicals once, back before life cut his badge in half. And now that same scent was whispering a memory he wished he'd forgotten. He looked at the name etched on the bottle's neck. Devereaux, the billionaire's rival. David paused, frowned, and for a second, the mop stopped moving. Something told him the night wouldn't end clean. The Langford Tower didn't rest, it presided. 58 floors of chrome and tempered glass cut a clean scar through Manhattan's night. At its top, the penthouse glowed, a sealed ecosystem of comfort where sound behaved itself and air was filtered of ordinary smell. Inside, money laughed. Victor Langford occupied the head of his table the way generals occupy high ground. He was the kind of billionaire who treated empathy as a negotiable expense. Every feature of him, silver hair, balanced tone, tailored restraint, promised that losing control was something other people did. Around him, guests collected. Senators trading favors for discretion, venture men who still mistook ruthlessness for vision, a film producer who thought proximity to power was a genre. They drank the evening like currency. Their laughter came in soft detonations, proof that each knew where he stood in the hierarchy and was pleased with the altitude. The table itself was a continent of marble. Every reflection on its surface confirmed Victor's success. He liked symmetry. 12 guests, 12 plates, 12 thin-stemmed glasses waiting for a bottle older than anyone present. It arrived cradled in white linen, escorted by an assistant who had learned silence the way some learn prayer. "From Devereaux," the assistant whispered, meaning the rival who had spent the last decade losing to Victor and now wished to disguise surrender as goodwill. Victor smiled the small smile that wins negotiations. "Kind of him," he murmured, already tasting triumph. The cork's sigh cut through conversation. Aroma followed. Dark fruit, oak, something metallic that belonged only to legend. The assistant poured the first measure into Victor's glass. He raised it toward the chandelier's light, admiring how the liquid caught gold and held it hostage. In the far reflection of the window, someone moved, a gray uniform, a mop angled with mathematic precision. David Cole. Night janitor, shift from 4 to midnight. Mid-50s, a body still serviceable, eyes that knew the difference between humility and defeat. He had been cleaning towers long enough to know their secrets, how glass hides fingerprints but keeps guilt. He preferred rooms after people had left them. They were honest then. The smell reached him before he realized he was breathing shallow. He knew disinfectants, sealants, all the artificial sweetnesses that buildings exhale. This was different. A faint almond undernote. Soft but wrong. It tugged something old in him. The long-ago rhythm of labs and hazard labels, before the downsizing, before the quiet firing that had converted a chemical safety officer into a janitor. The conversation at the table swelled toward another toast. Victor lifted the glass. David felt the body's old instinct overtake judgment. He stepped forward, mop still in hand. The sentence escaped him, unplanned, unadorned, and irreversible. "Don't drink that wine." Victor lowered the glass by a fraction, the kind of motion that denies it is a reaction. His mouth arranged itself into civility sharpened to a point. A billionaire's displeasure travels quickly. The table felt it and converted discomfort into entertainment. A senator recovered first, polishing his grin until it reflected cruelty. There is always someone eager to demonstrate which side he belongs on. A hedge fund jaw flexed, delighted by sport. A producer half rose, sensing content where dignity had been. The assistant remained still, bottle tilted at the elegant angle that says nothing is wrong until the owner decides it is. Two security men thawed from ornament into function, drifting toward David with the practiced softness of men who know how to move problems without leaving bruises. David did not retreat. He adjusted his hands on the mop so the head wouldn't slap the floor. He had no desire to escalate. He had less desire to become complicit. Training from a previous life hummed in him like a low, dependable generator. When the signal is wrong, you interrupt the sequence. Victor spoke at last, every syllable weighed like currency. The room listened for punishment and prepared to enjoy it. He did not give them a performance. He gave them precision. A glance to the assistant. A microscopic nod. Protocol moved. The bottle left the immediate circle, not hurried, not displayed, just gently removed from the story the table wanted to tell about itself. The first glass remained where it sat, an inch off its original mark, small evidence that certainty had wobbled. Humiliation is light, then heavy. It flared on David's skin and settled deeper, in the place where men keep their names safe. He did not offer biography. He did not announce that he once signed off on hazard reports and wrote memos that were never answered. He did not say the word he suspected, because suspicion without authority is how the powerless get punished. He kept to the one thing he could own, the interruption. Victor's eyes held him, not with curiosity, but with audit. He looked for motive and found none he liked. He looked for weakness and found none he could use. He looked for an exit for the evening and chose one. Continue as if the interruption were noise, but extract its source from the music. A security hand hovered near David's sleeve. David didn't flinch. He had learned the difference between being escorted and being dragged. He allowed himself to be placed in the hallway that buildings reserve for the unglamorous truths of their operation. The corridors of paint smell, recycled breath, low humming lights. Behind the door, the table regained its lines. Conversation resumed in careful increments, the way people walk across ice they trust but do not love. A guest performed bravery by sipping from his own pour, an act witnessed by exactly the number of people he needed to witness it. Another guest adjusted a cuff and made a remark about vintage that sounded like an alibi rehearsing itself. The woman who had watched without performing nudged her untouched glass half an inch farther from her plate and folded her napkin with the accuracy of a surgeon. No one noticed except the assistant, and the noticing troubled him. Victor stood rather than sit, a tactic he used when he needed the room to borrow steadiness from his posture. He spoke of deals and pivots, and the inevitability of outcomes engineered by people like him. The room complied, feeding him the small satisfactions that grease an expensive night, but the chord under the melody had changed key. Even the chandelier seemed to listen. In the hallway, the air was colder, as if uncertainty had a temperature. David stood between two men who didn't threaten him because they didn't need to. One checked his radio. The other studied David the way professionals study weather. Not moral, just consequential. "What did you smell?" hung between them, unsaid. David held the answer because the answer would only buy him more trouble. He watched the door. He counted a slow 30. He thought of the plant where two workers never came back from lunch, the audit that wore makeup, the meeting that used the word unavoidable like a bandage. Inside, the assistant eased the second bottle from a cradle, poured with hands that had never shaken in public. Guests lifted fresh glasses as if the evening could be restored by repetition. The senator performed a generous laugh. The hedge fund jaw performed indifference. The producer took out a phone to memorialize the restoration. Victor gave him a look that relocated the phone to a pocket without dialogue. Then the smallest accident. An air's sleeve brushed a stem. The glass toppled. The spill blossomed. Red ran toward the knife like a confession seeking a witness. Napkins lunged. The room exhaled in chorus. It was nothing. Truly, it meant nothing. Objectively. But the spill played the part the first bottle had auditioned for, a stain you cannot ignore. Victor's face did not move. Stillness can be a verdict. He spoke lightly. Clean it. It's fine. And in that lightness, the assistant heard a command that contradicted the word fine. The first glass, Victor's original pour, remained, a quiet, stubborn presence. The assistant looked at it the way one looks at a cliff from the wrong side of a guardrail. He did not remove it. Someone might ask why. He did not refill it. Someone might see. He polished an already spotless fork. In the hallway, the radio whispered, "Hold." Then another word that changes the night without raising its voice. Protocol. One guard's stance softened. Something had happened in the building's lower planar rooms, the rooms where paperwork means more than anyone's opinion. David watched the change travel up the man's spine and park in his eyes. The guard did not explain. Good guards don't. He simply didn't touch David again. The door opened a finger's width. A breeze of colder air slid out, carrying a hint of citrus from the kitchen and the faint ghost of expensive wax. David faced forward. He did not lean. He had already leaned as far into the night as a man without protection should. Inside, dessert cutlery arrived early. Victor finally sat, a concession to the theater that allows other people to decide when the scene is over. He examined the skyline with the polite superiority of a man who believes he is the skyline. He almost believed himself. The assistant spoke close to him, far from microphones that didn't exist. A message was delivered in a few exact words, the kind that arrive after a test strip chooses a color. Victor listened. He did not blink at the part where certainty changes tense. He did not show the part where mortality enters a room and refuses to leave by the service door. He looked at the original glass. It looked back the way inanimate objects do when you've given them too much meaning. He moved it another inch, left, then farther left, until it lived on the neutral territory between place settings. Guests pretended not to notice the relocation of danger. He rose. He ended the evening with a practiced economy that gave everyone permission to believe they had enjoyed themselves enough. Chairs whispered back, coats resurfaced from hidden closets. Compliments were paid to the cut of the beef and the view of the river and the host's unteachable grace under pressure that nobody would admit they'd seen. The lobby prepared its faces. The elevator rehearsed discretion between floors. Cameras blinked their neutral blinks. Everything behaved as if the order of things had not been questioned by a single sentence from a uniform built to disappear. In the hallway, David waited for a verdict in a language he could survive. The guard's radio clicked again and then fell silent. Silence meant the building was thinking. The door opened wider. The assistant appeared, composed to the millimeter. He glanced at David not as a man, but as a variable that had altered an equation and therefore needed naming. "Sir, we'll see you," the glance said. Translated into the only currency that matters upstairs, acknowledgement. David let go of the mop. It rested against the wall like a flag after a battle no one had televised. He stepped back into the light that had never been measured for him. The hall's air thickened as David stepped through the doorway again. The laughter had drained from the room, replaced by a silence that didn't know what it was hiding yet. Only Victor remained at the table, his hands resting lightly on the back of his chair. A man studying his own reflection in glass and not entirely liking what it showed him. The assistant stood behind him, still, a statue in black and white. The rest of the guests had been quietly escorted away with polite phrases that disguised urgency. Security hovered in the background, waiting for orders they hoped would not include them. Victor turned. For the first time that evening, his voice carried no audience polish. It was smaller, careful, the kind of voice that only comes out when certainty has been peeled back. "Why did you say that?" David did not look at the skyline or the marble or the symbols of power arranged like trophies. He looked at the man who had everything to lose. "Because something was wrong." No defiance, no sermon, just the truth delivered as a fact. Victor studied him for a long second, as if waiting for the rest, the plea, the apology, the explanation that would make the world simple again. It didn't come. The janitor stood still, unembarrassed by silence. He had already been humiliated enough for one lifetime. The assistant shifted, a subtle cue. The unspoken words between rich men travel fast. It meant, "It's confirmed." No one else heard it, but Victor did. A pulse jumped in his jaw. The sound of the city filtered through the glass. Cars, sirens, distant life, as if mocking how easily everything can vanish between one breath and the next. He turned away again, bracing both hands on the table. "Who told you to come back?" "No one." He nodded once. The muscles in his shoulders tightened and released. It wasn't anger. Not anymore. It was something colder, almost respect trying to remember its way out. The assistant cleared his throat softly. "Sir, the bottle—" Victor cut him off with a gesture. He didn't want to hear the word poison aloud. Not yet. Not before he could understand what it meant that someone beneath his notice had noticed everything. The chandelier above them flickered once, a brief pulse of light that threw both their shadows across the polished floor, the billionaire and the janitor, equal in silhouette. Victor reached for the wine glass, not to drink, but to look at it again. He turned it in his hand, watching the faint residue slide down the inside like time refusing to leave quietly. He set it down and stepped away. "You work nights?" "Yes, sir." "How long?" 3 months here. Longer elsewhere." He nodded again, a ritual to fill the space where apology should live. He looked at the glass once more, then at David. "You smelled what I didn't," he said finally, the words more to himself than to anyone else. There are moments when pride collapses quietly, like a tent unpegged by the wind. This was one of them. He didn't need to say thank you yet. The night wasn't finished teaching him what that word would cost. He exhaled. "Stay close." He walked toward the lobby without looking back, and the assistant followed. David hesitated, then followed too. Not because he'd been ordered, but because he felt the air itself pulling him toward something that hadn't yet happened. The elevator carried them down in silence. Each floor they passed hummed with lives that would never know how close the building had come to a headline. Victor stared at the digital numbers descending. David watched his reflection blur in the mirrored wall. 2 men separated by 1,000 differences and one truth. The line between life and death had been thinner than either wanted to believe. When the doors opened to the lobby, the air had changed again. Security, management, and a few lingering guests stood in small, uncertain clusters. Phones were out, but silent. Words had been replaced by waiting. Victor walked forward until he stood beneath the grand marble arch, where the company's name shimmered in steel letters above the reception desk. He turned slightly, eyes following the janitor who had stopped several steps behind him, unsure if he was supposed to be seen or disappear again. Victor raised a hand, motioning him closer. The motion alone rewrote the room. Every whisper stilled. David walked forward, the sound of his shoes loud in a place built to erase the noise of labor. When he stopped beside Victor, he didn't bow his head or smile. He simply stood there, A man who had chosen right when no one would have believed him if he'd been wrong. Victor looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, the billionaire's composure cracked, just slightly. It was the look of a man realizing the hierarchy he built had failed him. The assistant handed him a small piece of paper, a brief report, the kind that can change a life without needing more than 2 lines. Victor read it. The words were technical, clinical, but they landed like a verdict. He froze. Seconds stretched. Every face in the lobby watched the billionaire who had never once been caught off guard, standing motionless, eyes locked on a note that began with trace elements detected. He looked up. Across from him stood the janitor, silent, steady, almost invisible, until this very moment. Victor didn't speak. He didn't need to. The expression on his face said what the room already suspected. The janitor had been right. The wine had been death, dressed as luxury. And for the first time in his career, the billionaire understood how fragile power looks when it owes its survival to humility. He took one step closer to David. The elevator behind them chimed, breaking the silence. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, unaware that a man who ruled empires had just learned the meaning of gratitude. Then, in a voice low but deliberate, Victor said the first words of the twist to come. "Don't leave." Victor's voice, "Don't leave," had hung there, soft and final, and no one dared to disturb it. Every sound that tried to exist afterward, shoes, coughs, the mechanical sigh of doors, withdrew again, unwilling to contradict the command. The assistant dismissed the guards with a small motion. The janitor remained where he was, unsure if obedience still counted as safety. Victor turned toward the reception desk and the endless gleaming glass beyond it, the city stretching outward in its hypnotic indifference. He spoke quietly to the assistant. "Who handled the delivery?" The assistant listed names, times, a chain of custody rehearsed for audit. Victor listened without hearing. His mind ran the math of survival. Seconds between sip and silence. The slow coil of chemical certainty that had been waiting in that glass. He saw himself reflected in the polished floor, perfectly intact and completely ruined. "Bring it here," he said. Within minutes, a plain evidence bag arrived, handed off by security like contraband. Inside sat the bottle, half drained, dark, now stripped of its elegance by the plastic that held it. A white label on the bag carried 2 words in black ink. "Hazard confirmed." Victor froze. The words didn't move. His world, built on movement, did. He had negotiated hostile takeovers worth billions, rewritten contracts mid-flight, fired entire departments with a signature. But this was different. There was no leverage here. No clause, no consultant, no insurance. Only a sentence in permanent marker, and the man who had spoken truth in a room trained to mock it. He felt the heat of the moment crawl up his spine, the cold that follows it descend through his hands. His body, accustomed to controlling rooms, now obeyed physics instead. "Trace elements of cyanide compounds," the assistant whispered. They double-checked. Victor's throat tightened. He said nothing. He turned slightly, eyes finding the janitor still standing by the pillar. The man didn't look triumphant. He looked calm. A calm that comes from surviving too many insults to believe in new ones. Victor studied him the way people study weather, searching for the pattern they missed. He wondered how many times that face had passed him unseen in corridors he owned. He wondered how many other warnings had been swallowed by the silence of service. The assistant waited for instruction. Victor gave none. He was busy realizing that wealth could buy every precaution except instinct, and that instinct had come tonight wearing a gray uniform and worn-out shoes. "Get everyone out," he said finally. "Now." The staff scattered. Security began their sweep. Someone called the police, but Victor canceled it before the call connected. He didn't want headlines. Not yet. He wanted understanding. The lobby emptied until only the billionaire, the janitor, and the assistant remained. Victor crossed the marble floor, slow, deliberate, the way a man approaches a confession he never thought he'd have to make. He stopped a few feet from David. "Why did you do it?" David looked up. "Because it was right." Victor's jaw clenched. "You could have been wrong." "I wasn't." The reply wasn't arrogance. It was simple truth, steady as a heartbeat. Victor realized he was talking to someone who didn't measure courage by outcome. He stepped back. His hand brushed the evidence bag again, the crinkle of plastic loud in the silence. He had almost died, and the room had nearly applauded his death. He looked at the assistant. "Who knew?" "No one. Sir, only the testing lab and security." "Keep it that way." He didn't want to be pitied. He wanted to be precise. But precision couldn't clean this one. It could only expose it. He walked to the wide glass entrance and looked out at his city, his investments, his kingdom. It all looked smaller now, fragile under the weight of what he didn't know. The truth settled in. He had been saved by a man whose name he hadn't bothered to learn. The freeze came then, not physical, but existential. It was the stillness that happens when reality strips hierarchy of meaning. When the man at the top realizes how much of his life depends on those he never looks at. He saw it all replay in his head, the laughter, the mockery, the dismissive tone, and then the voice cutting through it. "Don't drink that wine." He had treated it as an inconvenience. Now it sounded like grace. He spoke without turning. "What did you do before this job?" "Safety," David answered. "Chemical safety." Victor nodded slowly. It made sense now. The calm, the certainty, the smell he'd missed, because rich men forget what danger actually smells like. "Why here?" "Work is work, sir. Bills don't care where pride ends." Victor winced, not visibly but internally, where his ego kept its archives. He turned around fully, facing David like a man forced to look into an unflattering mirror. "You know what that was?" "Yes." "You know what it means?" "Yes." Silence stretched again. It wasn't awkward. It was weight. Victor's gaze drifted to the chandelier above them, its dozens of glass pieces trembling faintly in the air conditioning. He'd bought it from an Italian craftsman who claimed it was impossible to break. He wondered now if that was true. The assistant stepped forward carefully. "Sir, the board will—" "Not tonight," Victor interrupted. The words carried a quiet finality that needed no volume. He looked back at David. "What's your full name?" "David Cole." "Noted." He started walking again, not toward the elevator, but toward the center of the lobby, where a long, polished desk reflected the ceiling's light. He stopped there, turned and faced the janitor as if the two of them had been cast in a play whose ending hadn't yet been written. "Mr. Cole," he said, the title deliberate, the first act of respect in a night built on arrogance. "You just saved my life." David didn't respond. There was nothing to say. He had done what conscience demanded. But the sentence changed the atmosphere of the room, subtly but completely. It rearranged the moral architecture of the night. The assistant looked from one man to the other, understanding that the world he worked in had just rotated a few degrees toward decency. Victor took a long breath, the kind that marks a decision forming. He motioned to the receptionist behind the desk. "Bring everyone back," he said. "All of them." The woman blinked. "Sir?" "All of them. The guests, the staff, the drivers waiting outside, everyone still in the building." The order carried authority. but not anger. It sounded almost like redemption rehearsing its first line. David frowned slightly, unsure what this meant, but the assistant gave him a small nod, a silent assurance that whatever came next, it was no longer humiliation. Minutes passed. People returned, confused, cautious, whispering. The air vibrated with curiosity. They had seen Victor angry, victorious, dismissive, never this still. He waited until they gathered, the senators, the financiers, the celebrities, all the people who had laughed earlier. They clustered together like expensive ornaments, unsure whether they were here to witness or to explain. Victor stepped forward, stopping under the chandelier. He looked at them with eyes that had aged an hour for every minute since the toast. He spoke plainly. "There's something you all need to know." The room hushed. Even the lights seemed to listen. "The bottle sent to me tonight was poisoned." A gasp rippled through the crowd, part shock, part fear, part disbelief. Victor let it settle. He pointed toward the evidence bag now sitting on the desk. "Tested. Confirmed. Someone tried to kill me." The words hung in the marble air like frost. He paused, then gestured toward the janitor. "And this man stopped it." Every head turned. The same faces that had mocked now struggled to reconfigure their expressions. The man they had dismissed had become the reason they were still alive enough to feel embarrassed. Victor continued, voice controlled but different now, stripped of grandeur, heavy with truth. "He saw what none of us did. He spoke when it was easier to stay silent. And because of that, I am still here." The assistant placed a folded document on the desk. Victor signed it with the same pen he used for acquisitions, the ink sliding over paper like a verdict written backward. He held it up. "This building, this company, owes its existence tonight to a man we didn't think we needed to listen to." He walked over to David and extended his hand. Every eye watched the gesture. It wasn't ceremonial. It was clean, unpracticed, real. David hesitated, then took it. The billionaire's grip was firm but humble, a handshake that rewired the hierarchy of the room. Victor turned back to the crowd. "Remember his name?" he said. "David Cole." He looked at the janitor again. "Tonight, you're not invisible. You're the man who saw what mattered." The room was silent. For the first time, it was a respectful silence. Outside, a siren passed, a single note stretching into the night. Inside, the billionaire who had frozen now understood that warmth doesn't always come from power. The lobby stayed hushed after the announcement. People looked at David the way they look at a storm that has already passed, but could have ruined everything. Victor's hand was still extended when the first ripple of applause began. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't choreographed. It sounded like the building exhaling. David didn't bow. He nodded once, almost apologetically, and stepped back a half pace, the distance that keeps humility from becoming spectacle. He could feel every eye on him, the same eyes that, an hour earlier, had treated him as decor. Now they stared as if proximity might transfer safety. Victor let the applause fade. He didn't want a performance. He wanted permanence. "Everyone go home," he said. His voice carried the calm that follows decisions. "The night is finished. I'll handle the rest." The crowd dispersed slowly, turning the lobby into a rehearsal of regret. Some stopped to murmur thanks to David. Most only offered the kind of glance that stands in for conscience. When the doors shut behind the last of them, the echo died quickly, swallowed by the carpet and the hour. Only 3 men remained: the billionaire, the janitor, the assistant. Victor walked toward the reception desk. "Sit," he said without force. David didn't move. "Please." The word sounded new in his mouth. David sat. Victor poured water from a crystal pitcher, the gesture automatic. He realized halfway through that his hands were shaking. He set the glass down, untouched. "I used to think power was control," he said. The words came slowly, almost experimentally, like he was testing them for truth. Tonight it looked a lot more like luck. He didn't expect an answer, and David didn't give him one. The assistant stood a few steps away, pretending to study the skyline where the first thin blue of morning had begun to argue with the night. Victor continued. "I built everything around the idea that people do their jobs because I pay them. You did yours because it was right. That's the difference." He turned to the assistant. "Bring me the employee records." The man hesitated, then left. The lobby fell into the kind of silence that follows confession. The marble reflected both men, one in a $1,000 suit, the other in uniform gray. Reflections have no hierarchy, they share the same height. Victor looked at his own shoes and laughed quietly. It was a tired laugh, not humor but recognition. "I don't think I've ever been this embarrassed," he said. David met his eyes for the first time since the outburst upstairs. "You're alive. That's enough." Victor nodded, a slow, deliberate nod that carried a weight apology could not. He picked up the untouched glass of water and drank it whole, as if testing the world again. The tremor in his hand steadied. The assistant returned with a thin folder. Victor opened it on the desk. "Cole, David. Maintenance, Night Division," he read aloud. Then, half to himself, "Chemical Safety Certification. Expired 10 years ago." He closed the folder. "That explains the smell," he said. Then, quietly, "And the courage." He wrote something on the back of an envelope, numbers, signatures, initials, the bureaucratic language of correction. He handed it to the assistant. "Effective immediately," he said. "Change his title, safety supervisor, and double his salary. No, triple it. He'll oversee training for every department." David started to protest, but Victor lifted a hand. "Don't mistake this for charity. It's logistics. You saved the most valuable asset this company has left, its credibility." The assistant nodded, already filing the details in his mind. He would make the changes before sunrise. Victor looked at David again. "You could have walked away when they laughed. You didn't. That's not something money can buy." He reached into his breast pocket and drew out a small metal pin shaped like the company's crest. He turned it over once in his hand before placing it on the desk between them. "For uniforms," he said. "Yours should mean something now." David looked at it but didn't touch it. He wasn't sure he needed symbols, but he understood gestures, and this one was clean. "Thank you," he said simply. Victor exhaled. It sounded like relief, fighting exhaustion. "I should be thanking you." He walked toward the glass doors, and David followed without being asked. Outside, the city's night was collapsing into dawn. Streetlights flickered off one by one. The sky shifted from black to the color of forgiveness. They stopped beside the revolving door. The morning air came in cool drafts. Victor studied the streets below, the indifferent taxis, the delivery vans, the early commuters whose lives had nothing to do with his empire or his near death. He spoke without turning. "Do you believe in fate, Mr. Cole?" "No," David said, "just choices." Victor smiled faintly. "Then tonight was a good one." He extended his hand again. This time it was not a handshake for display. It was a bridge built quietly over an old arrogance. David took it. Their grips met with the weight of things that cannot be undone. Behind them, the assistant cleared his throat. "Sir, the news will—" "There will be no news," Victor said. He turned, his expression composed again, but cleaner, as if stripped of its usual armor. "Let the story end where it should. A man saw something. He spoke. That's enough." He faced David once more. You can go home, Mr. Cole. When you come back tonight, there'll be a new badge waiting. David nodded. He turned toward the exit, pushing through the quiet spin of the glass door. The cold met him halfway. He stepped into it without flinching. From inside, Victor watched him cross the pavement and disappear into the thinning dark. He stayed there until the first light caught the letters of his name etched on the tower's facade. For the first time, it didn't look like victory. It looked like responsibility. He whispered something only the glass could hear. Then he turned back inside. The assistant waited near the desk. "Should I archive the incident, sir?" Victor thought for a moment. "No," he said. "Keep it open. Some things shouldn't be buried, they should be remembered." He walked toward the elevator, stopping at the evidence bag still on the counter. He looked at it once more, the bottle that had promised pleasure and carried death. He gestured for it to be taken away, sealed, gone. Then he looked at the empty space it left behind and nodded to himself. The doors closed. The lift began to rise. For a second, the mirrored wall showed his reflection beside the faint ghost of the janitors, as if the building itself were reminding him how the night had been balanced. Arrogance mistakes silence for safety. Integrity speaks even when it costs everything. And sometimes, the loudest warning in the world is the one no one expects to hear. If this story moved you, don't scroll away. Someone out there needs this reminder tonight. Hit subscribe to Hidden Tales Stories and help share stories that open eyes and change hearts. Like if you believe integrity still matters, share this to remind the world. Doing what's right can rewrite destiny. What would you have done if you were in the janitor's place? Speak up or stay silent? Do you think the billionaire truly learned his lesson? When was the last time you saw someone stand for truth despite humiliation? Comment, integrity wins. If you believe doing right will always pay off in the end. What moral did you take from this story? Humility, courage, or gratitude?